Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Insight Weekly. If you enjoy our content, please like, share and comment, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. As COVID-19 continues to evolve and dominate the headlines, we will be giving you an overview of the significant developments happening across each region this week, as well as some other key incidents that have happened. First of all, we will go over to Vincent, who's talking to us this week about South America.
Yeah, so this week I wanted to talk about the recent protests that have taken place across the region in the Americas. These protests are occurring for a variety of reasons and have a variety of targets. So in Brazil, we continue to see protests in Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and other major cities regarding the response by President Bolsonaro towards COVID-19. And those have been ongoing since mid-March. In other countries, we also see a variety of protests regarding where to locate vulnerable populations or even recovering COVID-19 patients. So we've seen those in Paraguay, in Chile, in Trinidad and Tobago, where people are protesting the location of centers to house certain people. We've also seen these recently in Bogota, Colombia, where certain neighborhoods have been tasked with housing Venezuelan migrants in sports centers within those neighborhoods, and the neighbors are protesting because they don't want those populations within their neighborhoods, just because their complaint is that the government will forget about them after a few months, and then those people might resort to crime, such as looting or theft. Other types of protests include healthcare workers protesting for a lack of PPE, personal protective equipment, and medical supplies to treat COVID-19 patients. We've seen these across Mexico, as well as the United States, where nurses have protested outside hospitals to demand more protective equipment to be able to treat those patients. We've also seen, finally, a protest by employees of certain companies, either to demand protective equipment or measures put in place, such as disinfecting distribution centers. And these protests have come particularly when certain employees might have tested positive for COVID-19 and worrying the rest of the employees. These have taken place, such as the Amazon distribution centers in Staten Island, as well as in Little Village, Chicago. And we've also had protests outside companies like General Electric, in Lynn, Massachusetts and Boston, where these employees have protested because of recent information that there would be layoffs. And so they've been protesting to ask that the factories, such as the aviation one in Lynn, Massachusetts, be refitted and repurposed to manufacture ventilators for COVID-19 patients as a means to then not conduct the layoffs. For me, I believe that the more dangerous protests are the ones like the Amazon ones, or we have also ones in Bogota where bicycle rickshaw drivers are protesting because they're unable to work due to the national quarantine, and so they're running out of income to use to feed themselves. We've also had protests in Venezuela where people are protesting because they haven't received their food portions from the government in the clap boxes. These protests are dangerous because the longer the quarantine measures take hold, the more desperate people might become. And these protests for now have remained fairly peaceful, but in the future, if quarantine measures continue to last much longer, these protests might have the potential to turn violent, which would be detrimental for the security of those cities and countries.
Thank you very much, Vincent. And over to Scott, who is giving us an overview of what's been happening in Europe this week.
So in terms of COVID-19 across the continent, we're seeing more of a mixed picture. Countries like Italy and Spain reporting decreasing numbers of new cases, however, obviously still very severe. In France and the UK, for example, cases are still continuing to increase. And obviously Boris Johnson, UK Prime Minister, still remaining in intensive care. At a more granular ground level, we're still seeing continued attacks on emergency services, including 2 nurses who were spat on at a hospital in Bury St Edmunds, as well as a police officer who was deliberately coughed on in Hull. This picture is quite similar across the continent. In France, for example, in Bordeaux, police officers attacked with stones as they tried to enforce lockdown measures. And quite significantly for France, the recent announcement that the flagship of the Navy, the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier, will be returning to its home port over fears that crew members have contracted COVID-19 and dozens have been quarantined. A similar picture across the rest of Europe, including Belgium, where we've seen examples of essential workers, including supermarket staff, being attacked, including one in Limahl, who was spat on by a suspect disguised as a nurse. And also further instances of price gouging and profiteering, including a butcher in Antwerp who was caught selling face masks for €50 or $54 each. An interesting example from Germany and Berlin. Police officers deployed to a refugee centre in support of firefighters were then attacked by local residents, and the result was that 43 of them had to be quarantined for 24 hours over fears of COVID-19 infection.
Thank you very much, Scott. And now we will go over to Viraj, who is giving us a summary of the key developments from Africa.
So this week, the World Bank have warned that the sub-Saharan African region could go into its first recession in 25 years, with GDP expected to shrink between 2 and 5%. Oxfam, the charity, have also warned that half of all jobs in Africa could be lost, and this will push millions more into poverty. Over the past week, we've seen protests in Kenya, especially around markets, where many traders have, they've accused the Kenyan government of denying them their daily income. I think there's a lot of anger surrounding the lack of assistance for lower income households and businesses, while sensitization campaigns and awareness raising continues around Africa. There seems to be deep skepticism surrounding the severity of coronavirus, but also there is anger, around the measures put in place. I think in the coming weeks, we'll see more protests like we have seen in Kenya, especially around markets. While several African countries such as Rwanda, Senegal, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria have or will introduce economic relief measures for lower income households, there are concerns around how these measures will reach those most vulnerable. In the case of Nigeria, only 60% of people have a bank account.
Thanks very much, Viraj. And finally, over to Max. What are you talking to us about this week, Max?
Yes, thank you, Laura. Today we're going to be looking at Lebanon, where a Hezbollah commander was killed by unidentified gunmen in the Nabatea area close to the Israeli border. So before we go into the details of the incident, I just want to look at who the commander himself was. So he's been identified as Ali Mohammed Yunus, and he's believed to be a mid-level commander of Hezbollah involved in counterintelligence. So more specifically, he's believed to have been involved in hunting down and destroying Israeli spy networks and networks of informants that are gathering information on the group. He's also believed to have had some form of relationship with Qasem Soleimani, the late IRGC commander who was killed by a US drone strike in Iraq. But again, the extent of this relationship isn't quite clear. We don't know whether that was more of just a professional relationship over the course of a few years or a close relationship with close coordination. So the attack itself was carried out on an empty road between 2 villages just south of Nabatea, and 3 cars containing gunmen are reported to have been involved. So Yunus was found with both stab and gunshot wounds. This is quite a violent attack. We aren't quite sure who carried out the attack yet. Immediate reporting came from Iranian media and Hezbollah itself, and a few Lebanese outlets who didn't speculate, but Iran and Hezbollah claimed that he was martyred by Israeli intelligence. And they often use the term martyred when they took them as almost like a code to say that they were killed by Israeli forces in hostile action. This is plausible, but at the same time, there are other theories out there. For example, One theory has claimed that he was killed due to a personal dispute with another Hezbollah commander over a financial issue, and another has claimed that this was actually related to the release of an Israeli agent. So this issue was quite contentious amongst Hezbollah leadership, because it essentially agreed to release an Israeli agent who was accused of being involved in torturing detainees. And as a result, the dispute over this caused a small rift within Hezbollah's leadership, and some have speculated that this killing was actually related to that and not the result of hostile action or the Israeli special forces. So again, these are all plausible theories, but at the moment there's just solid evidence saying which one's which. A few people have weighed in on this, and some have said that, for example, the area where they were killed is very remote and very open, and they struggle to see how 3 cars of gunmen would have, who are not from the area, would have been able to hide it from not only Hezbollah but security forces as well. So some people have cast a doubt on the claim that this was an Israeli operation. And others, for example, Iranian media in particular, continues to push that this was Israeli hostile action. All we know is that a Hezbollah commander has been killed, so we need to start thinking about looking forwards. So we need to keep an eye on whether Hezbollah will respond against Israel directly in the form of rocket attacks over the Lebanon-Syria-Israel border. Also, Hezbollah does have a presence in southern Syria near the Israeli border, so there's potential for rocket attacks there as well. But also, Hezbollah might just want to let this one blow over, so they might essentially ignore it, and especially if this wasn't carried out by Israeli forces, they might just quietly replace Yunus with another Hezbollah commander and leave it at that. Either way, going forwards, we'll be keeping an eye on the border of Israel, looking out for rocket attacks that may come in as a consequence of this.
And thank you very much to the team for your insights there. That is another episode, a remote episode of Insight Weekly, as we continue a nationwide lockdown here in the UK. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to leave your comments, ask us any questions. You may just be featured on next week's podcast. Thank you very much. See you next week.